I remember the silence first. Not what she said, not the room, just the way everything paused like the air was waiting for me to understand something I hadn't been told yet. "The day before the wedding," she said, almost casually. "My mom wants you at dinner tonight." No explanation, no warmth, just that. I nodded like it was normal. Like it made sense that a conversation like that would happen now, after everything had already been decided, booked, paid for. She watched me for a second too long. As if measuring something. I didn't ask questions. I didn't react, but something shifted. And I think she saw it. Because from that moment on, everyone started speaking very carefully around me. I have always preferred things that do not change. Not because I am afraid of change, but because I understand how easily it hides inside ordinary moments. People say stability is boring. I never saw it that way. Stability meant you could observe clearly. It meant patterns revealed themselves without noise. My days were structured. I woke up at the same time every morning before the alarm most days. The light came in through the same corner of the room, hitting the wall just above the desk. I would sit there for a few minutes before moving, letting the quiet settle into something I could carry with me. Work was predictable. Not easy, not exciting, just consistent. I handled numbers, reports, timelines, systems that behaved the way they were designed to. If something was wrong, there was always a reason. You just had to find it. I trusted that. It was probably why I trusted her. She wasn't loud or unpredictable. That was the first thing I noticed. When we met, she spoke carefully, like she measured the weight of her words before letting them out. There was no urgency in her. No need to impress or perform. That kind of calm is rare, and I recognized it immediately. We didn't build anything quickly. There were no sudden confessions or intense moments that forced meaning where there wasn't any yet. We just continued. Conversations became routines. Routines became habits. And habits, over time, started to feel like something permanent. I never asked for promises. She never offered them. But there was an understanding. Quiet, unspoken. The kind that feels more reliable than words. When we got engaged, it wasn't dramatic. No audience. No elaborate setup. Just a decision that made sense after everything that had already been established. I remember her looking at the ring for a long time after I gave it to her. Not emotional, not overwhelmed, just focused. "I think this will work," she said. Not "I love you." Not "I can't believe this." Just that, and I nodded because I agreed. That was enough for me. Her family was different, not in a way that was immediately concerning, just less transparent. Conversations felt layered. Like there were meanings underneath what was being said, but no one expected you to acknowledge them. Her mother especially. She was polite, always composed. The kind of person who never raises her voice, never interrupts, never makes a mistake in tone. But there was a precision to her interactions that felt deliberate. The first time we had dinner together, she asked me questions that seemed normal at first, about work, about plans, about how I saw the future. But the way she listened was different. She didn't respond immediately. She let silence sit for a second too long, as if comparing what I said to something else. I answered carefully, not defensively, just accurately. She nodded often, smiled when appropriate. There was nothing I could point to as wrong. And yet, when we left that night, I realized I couldn't remember a single thing she had said about herself, only what she had learned about me. I mentioned it once, casually. "She's just private," my fiancé said. "She likes to understand people first." That made sense, so I accepted it. Over time, her mother became part of the structure. Not intrusive, not controlling, just present. She would offer suggestions about the wedding, about logistics, about things that needed to be handled, always framed as help, always reasonable. I didn't resist. There was no clear reason to. If anything, it made things easier. Decisions were made efficiently. Plans moved forward without unnecessary discussion. I respected that. I have never been someone who needs control over everything. I just need to understand how things are working. And at that point, I believed I did. The wedding itself was never about spectacle. We agreed on that early. Something small, organized, clean, no unnecessary attention. We both preferred it that way, or at least I thought we did. Looking back now, I realize how much I accepted without question, not because I was careless, but because nothing at the time felt wrong enough to examine closely. That is the problem with quiet systems. They do not fail loudly, they adjust. They shift slightly, just enough that you continue trusting them, until one day something no longer aligns. And by then, everything already depends on it. At the time, though, everything still felt aligned, predictable, stable, understood. I went asleep each night believing that the life we were building was exactly what it appeared to be, nothing hidden. Nothing misaligned, nothing waiting underneath the surface. And if there were moments that didn't quite fit, I treated them the same way I treated small inconsistencies at work. I assumed there was an explanation. I just hadn't seen it yet. The first changes were small enough to ignore. That is how they begin, not as problems, not as clear disruptions, just slight deviations, things that do not match the pattern exactly, but not enough to justify stopping everything to investigate. At first, it was her attention, not absence. She was still there, still present in the same spaces, still responding when spoken to. But something in the way she listened had shifted. There were pauses where there hadn't been before, moments where I could tell she was deciding what to say, even in conversations that didn't require it. I noticed it one evening when we were reviewing a seating plan. It was simple, just a list of names and placements. Something we had already agreed would stay small and manageable. I asked her about a change, 2 names that had been moved. Did something happen with them? I asked. She looked at the page for a second longer than necessary. No, she said. I just thought it would be better this way. Better. It wasn't wrong, just incomplete. I nodded and let it go. A few days later, it happened again. Different detail, same pattern. A vendor time adjusted without explanation. A minor change in the schedule. Each time the answer was the same, calm, simple, closed. I handled it. I thought it would work better. It's already taken care of. There was nothing in her tone that invited further questions, so I stopped asking them. Her mother's presence increased around the same time, but not in a way that felt sudden. It was gradual, messages forwarded through her, calls that she had already taken, decisions that had been discussed before I heard about them, always framed as efficiency. We didn't want to bother you with small things. That was said once, almost casually. I remember that clearly, because I had never said I didn't want to be involved, but I also hadn't said the opposite, so the statement stayed unchallenged. There were moments when I entered a room, physical or conversational, and something would end just before I arrived. A message thread would go quiet. A call would be cut short. Not abruptly, not obviously, just concluded. When I asked what they were discussing, the answers were always available, but they were summaries, never the full conversation. She was just helping with the guest list. We were talking about timing. Nothing important. Nothing important. I started hearing that phrase often. At work, when something is labeled not important too quickly, it usually means someone has already decided how important it is, without showing the process that led them there. I recognized that. But recognition is not the same as reaction. I did not confront it. Instead, I adjusted. I began to pay attention in a different way, not just to what was said, but to what was omitted, not just to decisions, but to the timing of those decisions. I kept track of changes mentally, dates, details, sequences. There was no emotion attached to it, just observation. Still, there were moments that stayed with me longer than they should have. One afternoon, I called her while she was out with her mother. Wasn't urgent, just a question about a document I needed to send. She answered, but her voice was lower than usual. "I'll call you back," she said quickly. "I just need to. I'll call you back." The line ended. She did call back, 15 minutes later. Her tone was normal again. "Sorry, we were in the middle of something." "What were you doing?" I asked. "Just going over a few things." Which things I wanted to ask, but I didn't, because the answer would likely be the same. General, complete. Closed, there was another moment later that week. We were sitting together, not talking, just existing in the same space. Her phone lit up beside her, a message notification. I wasn't looking for it, but I saw her reaction, not fear, not guilt, adjustment. She picked up the phone quickly, angled it away slightly, and responded with a short message. Then she placed it face down. She noticed that I had seen. "It's just my mom," she said. I nodded. "I didn't ask," I replied. "I know," she said. And that was the end of it. No tension, no argument, just a small moment that settled into something unspoken. By then, I had already started telling myself what I needed to believe, that this was normal, that weddings create pressure, that families become more involved, that decisions have to be made quickly. All of that was true. And truth, when used correctly, can explain almost anything. That is what made it difficult to separate what was normal from what was not. Nothing had crossed a line. Nothing had broken. But the structure, the quiet, predictable structure I relied on, was no longer as clear as it had been. There were gaps now, small ones, easy to ignore, easy to justify. And so I did. Because at that stage, it still felt easier to adjust my understanding than to question theirs. The first time something did not align, it came from outside. That is what made it harder to dismiss. Up until that point, everything I had noticed could be explained internally, through stress, timing, miscommunication. The kind of things that happen when multiple people are managing the same event. But systems outside your control do not adjust themselves to protect a narrative. They just reflect what has been entered into them. It was a call from one of the vendors, a catering coordinator, someone we had both met together weeks earlier. I recognized her voice immediately. "I just wanted to confirm the cancellation," she said. I did not respond right away. "Cancellation," I repeated. "Yes," she said, still professional, still calm. "We received the request yesterday. I just need verbal confirmation before we proceed with the final processing." There was a brief silence on my end. "No," I said. "There must be a mistake." Another pause. "I can check the request details," she replied. "It came through from the primary contact on file." Primary contact. I already knew who that was. "I'll call you back," I said. I ended the call before she could say anything else. When I found her, she was at the table, reviewing something on her laptop. The screen dimmed slightly as I approached, but she did not close it. "There's a call about the catering," I said. She didn't look up immediately. "Okay," she replied. "They said it was canceled." That made her pause, just for a second. Then she continued scrolling. "I handled that," she said, the same phrase, calm, controlled. Without explanation. "Why?" I asked. She leaned back slightly, as if considering how much detail was necessary. "It wasn't the right fit," she said. "I found something better." Better, I waited. No additional information came. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. That was the first time she looked directly at me. "I was going to," she said. "It just happened quickly." Quickly, I let the words sit between us. "Who is the new vendor?" I asked. "I'll send you the details," she said. "Not now. Later." I nodded. "Okay," I said. And that was the end of the conversation, at least on the surface. She did send the details, an email forwarded without context. A different company, different pricing structure, different terms. I read through it carefully. There was nothing obviously wrong, but it wasn't what we had agreed on, and more importantly, the decision had already been executed before I was even aware of it. That was new. Up until then, changes had been small. Adjustments within a shared understanding. This was a replacement, a complete shift without discussion. I did not confront her again. Instead, I made a note of the timeline. The cancellation request had been sent the day before the vendor called me, which meant the decision had been made at least a day earlier, possibly longer. I tried to recall where she had been that day, what we had discussed. There was nothing, no mention, no indication. That absence stayed with me. A few days later, something similar happened. Different context. Same pattern. I received an automated notification from the venue's system, a routine update. Something about revised access hours for the day before the event. I opened the details. The changes were significant, setup time reduced, restrictions added, none of which we had discussed. I checked the modification history. The request had been submitted 2 days earlier, approved the same day, authorized under her name. I did not bring it up immediately. Instead, I waited. That evening, when we were sitting together, I asked casually, "Did anything change with the venue schedule?" She didn't hesitate. "No," she said, "everything's the same." The response came too easily, too clean. I watched her for a moment, not her words, her posture, her breathing. Nothing changed. If there was hesitation, it wasn't visible. "I got a notification," I said. That introduced a pause, small but present. "Oh," she said, "that." She closed her laptop slowly. "It's nothing major," she added. "Just a small adjustment. They do that sometimes." "They reduced the setup time," I said. "It won't affect anything," she replied. "How do you know?" I asked. She looked at me again the same way she had before, measured, calm. "Because I've already worked it out," she said. There it was again, already handled, already decided, already closed. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I understood something I hadn't fully accepted until that moment. These were not isolated decisions. They were part of a pattern, one where information reached me only after it had been finalized, one where my role was no longer to participate but to accept. And the explanations, when they came, were not meant to inform. They were meant to conclude the conversation. That night I stayed awake longer than usual, not thinking in a scattered way, just reviewing details, sequences. Timing, the catering cancellation, the venue adjustment, the conversations that had not happened, the explanations that came too late. None of it proved anything on its own, but together it formed something that could no longer be ignored. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a direction. And for the first time, I stopped trying to explain it away. I started trying to understand it instead. I did not confront her all at once. That would have been easy to dismiss. Instead, I chose smaller questions. Specific ones, controlled, the kind that could not be misunderstood and did not rely on emotion. I waited for the right moments when the environment was quiet, when there was no urgency, no external pressure to influence the response. The first time I kept it simple. "Why wasn't I included in the catering decision?" She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she was deciding which one to give. "You were busy," she said. It was said gently, almost considerate. "I wasn't," I replied. A small pause followed. "Well," she adjusted, "you didn't seem interested in the details." I let that sit. "I asked about the vendor last week," I said. "You asked generally," she replied, "not specifically." The distinction was precise and deliberate. I nodded slightly as if considering her point. "So you assumed I didn't need to know?" I asked. "I assumed you trusted me to handle it," she said. That was the first time she used trust as a response. Not as something mutual, as something expected. I did not argue. I moved on. A few days later, I brought up the venue changes. "The schedule was adjusted," I said. "Why wasn't that discussed?" She exhaled quietly, a subtle shift in tone. "It wasn't a major change," she said. "It affects the setup time," I replied. "It's manageable." "That's not what I asked." She looked at me then, more directly than before. "You're focusing on small things," she said. The words were calm. but they carried weight. Small things become larger if they're consistent, I said. That was the closest I came to stating a pattern. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back, creating a slight physical distance between us. I think you're overthinking this, she said. There it was, not a denial, a reframing. The issue was no longer the decisions, it was my interpretation of them. I'm asking for clarity, I said. And I'm giving it, she replied, but she was closing the conversation. Not resolving it, I could see that clearly now. The next time her mother was present, we were sitting together reviewing a checklist. Something she had prepared, structured, detailed, efficient. I recognized the format immediately. It was designed to move quickly. Decisions were presented, not discussed. I waited until there was a pause. I'd like to understand how some of these changes are being made, I said. Her mother looked at me, her expression neutral. Which changes? She asked. Specific, controlled. The catering, I said. The venue schedule, a few other adjustments. She nodded slowly. All of those have been handled, she said. I understand that, I replied. I'm asking why I wasn't included. Another pause, not uncomfortable, measured. You're included now, she said. The response was almost exact, closed, complete, and intentionally insufficient. That's not the same, I said. Her expression didn't change. These are operational details, she continued. They require quick decisions. We didn't want to burden you unnecessarily. The same phrasing as before, but now reinforced. It's not a burden, I said. It can be, she replied gently, especially when someone prefers not to engage in every detail. I understood what was happening. The narrative was being constructed in real time, not aggressively, not obviously, but precisely. I was being positioned as someone who had chosen distance, who had delegated responsibility, who was now questioning decisions that had been made on his behalf. It was subtle, but effective. I didn't say I preferred that, I said. Her mother smiled slightly. No, she agreed. You didn't. The sentence lingered, incomplete, implying something without stating it. My fiancé remained quiet during this exchange, observing, letting her mother lead. That more than anything stood out, not disagreement, not support, just alignment through silence. I could feel the shift then, not in their tone. In my position, I was no longer part of a shared process. I was being managed, carefully, respectfully, but managed. After that, the conversations became shorter, not because there was less to discuss, but because the outcomes were already determined before the discussions began. When I asked questions, the answers followed a pattern: reassurance, deflection, conclusion. You're worrying too much. It's already taken care of. Everything is under control. Each statement designed to reduce the need for further inquiry, and each one in isolation reasonable, together restrictive. I stopped asking as often, not because I was satisfied, but because I understood the structure. Questions did not lead to information. They led to containment. And containment over time changes how you are perceived. I could feel that happening, subtly, gradually. I was becoming the variable in a system that had already decided its outcome, not the problem. Not directly, but the uncertainty, the element that needed to be stabilized. And the way they did that was by narrowing my role, limiting my input, and redefining my concerns as something internal, something personal, something that did not require external validation. I did not challenge it, not yet, because by then I had realized something important. If I reacted emotionally, the narrative would solidify. If I argued, I would confirm their position. So I didn't. I stayed quiet. Listened, watched, and let the pattern continue long enough to see where it ended. I stopped asking questions, not because I had accepted anything, but because I understood that answers were no longer reliable sources of information. They were controlled outputs, filtered, timed, delivered with the intention of closing, not explaining, so I shifted to something else. Verification, not confrontation, not suspicion in the emotional sense. Just a need to align what I was being told with what actually existed outside of those conversations. The first confirmation came quietly. I contacted the original catering coordinator again, not to reverse anything, just to understand the sequence of events. I asked for a copy of the cancellation request. She sent it without hesitation. It was a standard form, simple, structured, the kind of document designed to remove ambiguity. The request had been submitted under my fiancé's name, but that was expected. What mattered was the detail attached to it. There was a note, short, direct. Client has decided to move forward with a different arrangement. All further communication should be directed through the family representative. Family representative, that phrasing did not come from her. It was too formal, too detached. I read it several times, not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. It reframed the structure completely. She was no longer the point of coordination, and I had never been. There was someone else being positioned in that role. I didn't need to ask who. The next step was the new vendor. I reviewed the contract again, this time more carefully. Not the pricing, not the services, the authorization details. The primary contact listed was not her. It was her mother. There was a secondary contact, also not me, a number I didn't recognize. I checked the communication history attached to the file. Emails, confirmations, adjustments, all of it routed through those two contacts. My name appeared only once. In the billing section, responsible party. That was the first time something felt precise, not vague, not open to interpretation, defined. My role was not to decide, not to coordinate, not even to be informed, just to be accountable. I closed the document and sat with that for a while. There was no immediate reaction, no anger. Just a steady realization of what had already been structured. Later that week, another piece aligned. This time unintentionally, a call from the venue manager, routine at least on the surface. He was confirming final numbers, guest count, access timing, payment schedule. We went through the details one by one. Then he paused. "I just want to confirm," he said, "that the revised booking arrangement is still in place." I didn't respond immediately. "What arrangement?" I asked. A brief silence. "The updated structure," he clarified. "The one submitted earlier this week." I kept my voice steady. "Can you explain that?" He hesitated, not because he didn't know, but because he was deciding whether he should. "It may be easier if you review the updated agreement," he said. "Send it," I replied. He did. Within minutes, I opened it. And this time the shift was undeniable. The event had been reclassified, not canceled, not postponed. Adjusted. The scale had changed. The structure had changed. And most importantly, the financial arrangement had changed. Significantly, deposits had been redistributed. Payment timelines altered. Additional services added, all approved, all authorized, none discussed. My name remained where it had been before, attached to the financial responsibility, but absent from every decision that created it. I read through the document twice. Then once more, not looking for errors, looking for intent. There was none stated, but the pattern was clear. Decisions were being made in a closed system, one I was not part of, but one that depended on me. That night, I didn't bring it up. I didn't ask her about the family representative. I didn't mention the contract or the venue changes. Instead, I observed the way she moved through the evening, calm, unhurried, unaffected. There was no indication that anything had shifted, no sign that she expected a reaction, which meant one of two things. Either she believed I still didn't know, or she believed it didn't matter if I did. Neither option required immediate confrontation, because confrontation would not create clarity. It would only trigger the same responses I had already seen. Reassurance, deflection, conclusion, so I did something else. I documented, not physically, mentally. Timelines, names, roles, the order in which things had changed, the points where information had been withheld, and the moments where explanations had replaced transparency. By the end of that process, the situation was no longer unclear. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't stress. It wasn't a series of isolated decisions. It was a structure, intentional, layered, and functioning exactly as designed. The only part that remained uncertain was the purpose, and I understood that I would not get that from asking, only from watching what happened next. The dinner was set for that evening. No discussion about whether I could attend. No consideration of timing. Just an expectation that I would be there. "My mom wants you at dinner tonight." That was how it had been presented. Not an invitation, a decision. I arrived exactly on time, not early, not late. There was no reason to create an impression beyond consistency. The house was quiet when I entered, the kind of quiet that feels prepared rather than natural. Everything was already in place. The table was set with precision. Plates aligned, glasses positioned evenly, cutlery arranged in a way that suggested more attention than necessary. It wasn't excessive, just deliberate. Her mother greeted me first, warm but measured. "I'm glad you could make it," she said. I nodded. "Of course." My fiancé appeared a few seconds later. Her expression was neutral. Not distant, not welcoming, just controlled. We sat. There was no immediate conversation. Just the sound of small movements, chairs adjusting, water being poured, the quiet rhythm of a setting that had already been structured before I arrived. Dinner began without introduction. No one explained the purpose of the evening, which meant it already had one. The conversation, when it started, stayed within safe boundaries. Work, timing, general logistics, nothing that required commitment or detail. I responded when necessary, briefly, without expanding beyond what was asked. I could feel the pacing. They were waiting, not for me to speak, for the right moment to begin. It came midway through the meal. Her mother set her glass down carefully before speaking. "We've made a few final adjustments," she said, not looking at me directly at first, just placing the statement into the space. I didn't respond immediately. I let her continue. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she added. "Just refinements to ensure everything runs smoothly." The phrasing was familiar, controlled, complete. I looked at her then. "What kind of adjustments?" I asked. She met my gaze calmly. "Operational ones," she said. "Timing, coordination, a few structural elements." Structural, another precise word. "I've reviewed some of the changes," I said. That introduced the first real pause of the evening, small but different from the others. Her mother's expression remained steady. "Then you understand," she replied. "I understand that I wasn't included," I said. My tone didn't change, no accusation. Just a statement. My fiancé shifted slightly in her seat, not enough to draw attention, but enough to register. Her mother folded her hands lightly on the table. "Including everyone in every detail can create unnecessary complications," she said. "Only if they're not expected to be involved," I replied. Another pause. This one held longer, not uncomfortable, but heavier. "We've been trying to keep things efficient," she continued. "There are time constraints, expectations." "Whose expectations?" I asked. This time she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced briefly at my fiancé, a small movement, but it carried weight, alignment. Then she looked back at me. "Family expectations," she said, that word again, family defined, closed. "And my role in that?" I asked. My fiancé spoke for the first time since the conversation had shifted. "You're overcomplicating this," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a firmness now. "It's just a wedding." "Just a wedding," I nodded slightly. "Then why has the structure changed?" I asked. Her response came quickly. "It hasn't," she said. I held her gaze for a moment, then I spoke. "The catering contract was reassigned to your mother," I said. The venue arrangement was modified, additional services were approved without my involvement, and communication has been redirected through a family representative. The words were delivered evenly, not rushed, not emphasized, just placed into the conversation. The silence that followed was different, not controlled, not structured, real. Her mother's expression didn't break, but it adjusted, slightly. "You've been reviewing documents," she said. "Yes," I replied. There was no reason to deny it. "That wasn't necessary," she said. "I disagree," I said. Another pause. My fiancé looked at me now directly. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before, not guilt, not anger, recognition. "You weren't supposed to go through all of that," she said. The sentence settled quietly. Not defensive, just factual. I let it sit for a moment. Then I asked the only question that still mattered. What was I supposed to do? Neither of them answered immediately. Her mother exhaled slowly, the first visible shift in her composure. "This isn't about excluding you," she said. "It's about managing a situation in the most appropriate way." "What situation?" I asked. Another glance between them, short, but enough. My fiancé spoke again. "This doesn't need to become something bigger than it is," she said. "It already is," I replied. That was the first time my tone changed, not louder, just final. The conversation had reached its edge, not because of conflict, but because the structure they had relied on was no longer holding. The information had aligned. The pattern was visible, and for the first time they understood that I could see it, fully, completely, without needing them to explain it. Her mother straightened slightly, recomposing. "If there are concerns," she said, "we can address them after the wedding." After, not now, not here, deferred, controlled, I nodded once. Not in agreement, just acknowledgement. That was the moment I understood what this dinner was. Not a discussion, not a clarification, a confirmation. They had already moved forward, with or without me. And this carefully structured conversation was meant to ensure that I remained aligned with something I had not been allowed to shape. I didn't respond again after that. There was nothing left to ask, because the answers at that point were already clear, not in what they said, but in what they had done, and more importantly, in what they expected me to accept. I did not leave immediately after dinner. That would have turned the moment into something visible, something they could define. Instead, I stayed, not engaged in conversation, not contributing. Just present long enough for the structure of the evening to complete itself without interruption. Plates were cleared, glasses were moved, small, controlled movements that signaled the end of something that had already served its purpose. No one returned to the topic, which confirmed what I already understood. For them, the conversation was finished. For me, it had just become clear. When I stepped outside, the air felt colder than it should have. Not because of the temperature, but because of the absence of noise. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, it presses. I stood there for a moment before moving, not thinking in fragments, not reacting, just aligning everything I had seen, the documents, the contracts, the phrasing, the dinner, all of it pointed in the same direction. This was never about managing details. It was about control, not loud control, not obvious, structured, systematic. They had built a process that removed me from every decision while keeping me responsible for the outcome. And they had done it gradually, carefully enough that each step on its own could be explained. Together it could not. I drove home without turning on the radio. No distractions, just the steady repetition of one realization. There was nothing left to clarify, only something to decide. Inside the apartment, everything was exactly where it had been that morning. The same arrangement, the same stillness. No indication that anything had shifted, but it had, completely. I sat down at the desk and opened my laptop, not to search, not to confirm, just to organize. The contracts were already downloaded, the emails saved, the timelines clear. I reviewed them again, not because I needed to, Because I wanted to see if anything had been missed. There was. Every detail supported the same structure. Every document aligned with the same outcome. And that was the moment I reached the point I had been avoiding. Not emotionally. Logically. If I continued, I would be entering a system where my role had already been defined without my consent, where decisions would be made around me, not with me, where responsibility would remain mine but authority would not. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a design. And designs, once established, do not change without disruption. The question was not whether I could confront them. I could. The question was what that would achieve. I already knew the pattern. Denial. Reframing, minimization. Any confrontation would be absorbed into that structure, reinterpreted, contained. It would not produce truth, only resistance, so I did something else. I removed emotion from the equation, not suppressed it, separated it. There was a difference. Emotion would have pushed for immediate action, for clarity through conflict, for resolution through expression. But clarity had already been achieved. Conflict would not improve it. It would only complicate the outcome. I opened the payment schedules, reviewed the upcoming transactions, dates, amounts, authorization requirements. Everything was still within a window of control, not permanent, but not final either. Then I reviewed the contractual obligations, cancellation clauses, modification terms, points where the system allowed for adjustment, not based on opinion, based on structure. That was where the leverage existed, not in conversation. In process, I made a list, not long, just precise. What needed to be paused? What needed to be reviewed? What needed to be documented formally? No assumptions, only actions supported by the agreements already in place. I did not contact anyone that night. There was no urgency. The timeline was clear, and acting too early would only create unnecessary attention. Instead, I closed the laptop and sat there for a while, not reflecting on the relationship, not questioning what it had been, just acknowledging what it was now, defined, measured. Understood. There is a point in every situation where the uncertainty ends, not because everything is explained, but because the remaining unknowns no longer change the outcome. This was that point. I did not feel anger, not in the way people expect. There was no need for it. Anger implies surprise. And by then, there was none left, only clarity. And with clarity comes responsibility, not to react, but to act correctly. That night, I slept without difficulty, not because I was at peace, but because the decision had already been made. Quietly, completely, without needing to be spoken. I did not announce anything the next morning. No messages, no calls, no attempt to reopen the conversation from the night before. There was no reason to. Everything that needed to be said had already been expressed, just not through words. Instead, I followed the structure. The same one they had relied on. Only this time I used it fully. The first step was timing. Most of the payments were scheduled to process within the next 48 hours. Final confirmations, remaining balances, the kind of transactions that move quietly unless something interrupts them. I logged into the accounts and reviewed each one carefully. Authorization settings, approval chains, points where a single action could pause the entire sequence. There were several, enough. I didn't rush. Each change was made within the rules of the system. No violations, no irregular activity. Just adjustments that required additional verification before funds could be released. A delay, not a cancellation, not yet. Then I moved to the contracts. The catering agreement had already been replaced, but the cancellation clause for the original vendor was still active, pending final confirmation. I responded to the coordinator's earlier message, not emotionally, formally. I requested a hold on the cancellation processing, citing a need for internal verification. She acknowledged it within minutes. Simple, contained. Next was the venue. The revised agreement allowed for modification under certain conditions, specifically if there was a discrepancy in authorization or financial responsibility. I submitted a request for review, not an accusation, a procedural check. It required documentation. I provided it. Then I stopped. No further action, no escalation, because at that point the system would begin to respond on its own. Around midday, the first message came through, from her. Did something happen with the payments? I read it once, then again. The wording was careful, not direct, not confrontational, just aware. I didn't respond immediately. There was no benefit in speed. A second message followed shortly after. Some of the vendors are saying there's an issue. Still controlled, still measured. I waited another hour before replying. I requested a review, I wrote, nothing more. The response came quickly this time. Why? A single word, direct. I considered it for a moment, then I answered. Because the agreements don't align with what was presented to me. There was a pause, longer than before. When she replied, the tone had shifted slightly. You could have just asked. I read that line several times, not because it was confusing, because it was expected. I responded once. I did. No explanation, no elaboration. The conversation ended there, for a while. Later that afternoon, her mother contacted me. Not through a message, a call. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was composed as always. There seems to be some disruption, she said. Temporary, I replied. A brief silence followed. These arrangements were already finalized, she continued. They were, I said. Then why interfere now? The question was structured to imply fault. I answered it the same way. I'm reviewing obligations attached to my name. Another pause, measured. You're creating unnecessary complications, she said. Only where they already exist, I replied. Her tone remained steady. But there was a difference now, less control, more resistance. This could have been handled privately, she said. It still is, I replied. That ended the call, not abruptly, just completely. By the evening, the system had done what it was designed to do. Vendors began requesting clarification. Authorizations were flagged, timelines shifted, nothing dramatic, just friction, the kind that exposes structure. Because once a process is interrupted, every hidden dependency becomes visible. Who has authority, who does not, who is responsible, and who has been acting without alignment. I didn't need to explain anything further. The documentation did that. The contracts did that. The timing did that. And for the first time, the situation was no longer contained within controlled conversations. It existed in records, in systems, in places that could not be reframed or dismissed. That evening, there were no more messages. No calls, just silence. Not the quiet from before. This was different. Not controlled, not structured, uncertain. And uncertainty, when it enters a system built on control, does not settle easily. I closed my laptop and stepped away. There was nothing left to initiate. Everything else would unfold on its own, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through the natural outcome of a structure that had finally been forced to reveal itself. The wedding did not happen. There was no single moment where it was officially canceled, no announcement, no final conversation that marked the end. It dissolved, gradually. Vendors withdrew as timelines collapsed. Agreements expired under review. Arrangements that depended on continuous approval simply stopped moving forward. No one said it directly, but the structure no longer held. And without the structure, there was nothing left to carry it. I did not receive an apology, not from her. Not from her mother. There were a few messages in the days that followed. Short, careful, focused on logistics rather than explanation. What happens next? Can this be resolved? I read them. I understood what they were asking, but I did not respond, because the answers were already present, in the documents, in the sequence of decisions, in the outcome that had followed. Anything I said would only reopen something that had already reached its conclusion, so I let the silence remain. Not as punishment, just as the most accurate response. I moved my things out a week later. There was no argument, no confrontation. She wasn't there when I did. That, too, felt consistent with everything else. Controlled, avoided, unspoken. The apartment looked the same when I left, ordered, intact, as if nothing had changed, but I knew better because I had seen how easily something can appear stable while shifting underneath. I returned to my routine. The same mornings, the same quiet. The same structure, but not the same assumptions. Trust, I realized, is not built on words or consistency alone. It depends on alignment, on being present in the decisions that define what something is. Without that, everything else is just presentation. I don't think about them often, not because it doesn't matter, but because it already resolved itself, completely. There was no confrontation, no exposure, no final moment of truth. Just a system that revealed itself when it was no longer supported. And silence, that said everything that needed to be understood.